Another day, another hit. Black smoke coming up. People are running. The shelling has started. We are trying to find where it hit, but in an urban environment, it's extremely hard to find. Even if you were there, you heard the explosion and you saw the debris fall. And finally, I meet my friend, the great photographer of Kherson, Alexander Kornikov, working for Suspilny, previously Goro, and he showed me where it hit. It's a few yards away from where I was, actually.
Щось прилетело.
Дуже гучно було.
Впечатление, одеваешь кастрюлю на голову и по кастрюле что-то сильно бьешь.
This is a regular residential house with a playground right behind me here, and people planted flowers here. As we are filming, the shelling continues. 2 hours later, workers are already here fixing the glass, fixing the windows, working on the balconies, just mainly putting the plywood over the window because at night it still can get cold.
So today I'm once again tremendously delighted and honoured to be talking to Zarina Zabrisky. And I'm going to get her to introduce herself a little bit. She does tremendous work reporting right across Ukraine in some of the hottest areas as well, and has consistently done that for year after year, which requires enormous mental strength. Zarina, could you say a few words about yourself and your experience in Ukraine, just so people get a little bit of background, of how engaged you are and how long you've been out here reporting?
Right. Well, hi, Jonathan. Hi, everyone. Thanks for having me again. Last time we spoke about Georgia, hybrid warfare in Lviv, and this time we'll come back again to hybrid warfare, but we'll start with the conventional hot phase of the war, and that's where I am right now, at the very front line in the southern city of Kherson, which is on the so-called right or western bank of the Dnipro River, and right across the river from us, we have the Russian troops from me about 2 miles, and they like to take advantage of this proximity. So if you hear some loud sounds, that happens here quite a bit, although tonight should be quiet, as I told Jonathan, because it's raining, and during the rain or fog, there are less drones, less artillery, and the reason I know all this because I'm basically now sort of a resident of Kherson, because I've been working here on and off with trips to other parts of Ukraine, but almost for 2 years from the liberation of Kherson, I started to come here. Before that, I worked in Odesa. I'm from California. Weird accent is because I was born in the former Soviet Union. My family, part of the family was actually from Ukraine, from Odessa and Uman. So it's kind of like coming back to my roots. The advantage is I speak Russian, I speak Ukrainian, I speak Surzhyk, which is a dialect that is being spoken here, and some of them better, some of them worse. And I write in English only, and I write for Byline Times, which is a fabulous newspaper out of London. I recommend Euromaidan Press, another fantastic publication. That's a Ukrainian one in English out of Kiev.
Alexandra, the editor's been on as well. Fantastic journalist.
Alia is a genius, so is Peter Jukes. That's why I write for them. I kind of choose my publications. I write for my local California newspaper, Fresno Alliance, kind of very, very left, almost too left for me, but they're very good. And they have been running my dispatches, monthly dispatches from Ukraine for the last 2 years or even more. And I will write for anyone because I'm a freelance. So sometimes Sunday Post, Times of India, I mean, you name it, whoever will take it. I did some video and broadcast TV, radio shows. Just basically, my goal is to bring the reports from the ground, from the places that are hard to access and that are not covered enough to the world. And that's why I'm in Kherson so often. That's why I'm in Sumy region quite a bit. Kherson was under an extremely intense artillery fire. And we're at the site where a woman was killed by the artillery. The drones.
Он высматривает пожарную машину.
That's why the drone was here. А скільки поранених?
Ну, ми знаємо за одного, там загиблий. Все.
We're going right under the power lines. Here's the car that was hit. Okay, let's go. Let's go.
Я показать, как я был? А это разведос.
So the no energy, no infrastructure strikes going really well. I'm right now in a supermarket in Kherson, and there's no light. That means no refrigeration. Most of Kherson has no electricity right now. Somehow I feel these important regions are falling through the cracks of the war. And this is, again, something which we are planning to visit today with Jonathan.
Well, you have talked very eloquently, and actually, this is a story that did cut through a little bit, which is the human safari in Kherson. And you and Kaylin Robertson, probably, two of the most vocal ones that have cut through, especially on social media with this story. That was a few months ago when that hit. And all the story that's dominating the headlines now is peace talks, will they, won't they, blah, blah, blah. But at the same time, it seems there's been a huge uptick in violence, which is exactly coincidental with all this so-called peace talks, and yet it's not getting the attention it deserves. You very forcefully described this before we hit record as a Russian Armageddon that is now taking place in Kherson. Could you describe the uptick in the intensity of that and how that manifests itself?
Right. Oh, and one of the reasons it's not being covered as much is that there are not many, in fact, there are not many. I'm the only foreign journalist resident here because it's very hard to get a permit. And it takes time, it takes money, so that's just a technical issue. But also, since the story was broken about in October 2024, there were about 100 articles already in all the major newspapers and all the major broadcasting companies. But there's something about it, and I spoke to psychologists about it. There's a psychological defense kicking in because human safari is just such an atrocity and such a horrid crime. It's sort of like concentration camps that the mind, the psyche refuses to go there. And I deal with that when talking to editors. And so last week, as you said, uptick is probably a good word, if not more. I've been reporting from the war zones, and I've been to Donbass and here in Kherson and in Kharkov, Odesa, and all kind of intense bombing, aerial bombs, drones, but I've never seen anything like what I have seen on March 27th, which locals have labeled Armageddon. There were like literally black smoke coming all over the city, which happens here. Through that black smoke, we had drones flying by. And usually I have a hard time filming drones. A lot of editors asking, why can't you provide a good quality picture or a video footage of a drone? Well, because it will be my last picture or footage. But not that day. That day I was trying to just snap the pictures or grab the videos of artillery destruction and through my camera view, there will be drones flying right through it. And because they hit the power infrastructure, the electronic warfare units or jammers were down. And therefore, the Russian drones can go right through, because most of the time the city is being protected by the jammers. It is a frequency warfare. So by now, there's quite a lot of equipment here. And the Ukrainian authorities, Ukrainian military, and even civilians are working hard on protecting themselves here, but not when the electricity lines are down. And that happened to be on the day when all the news were chatting about the ceasefire and how successful it was. And the White House was sharing reports on the achievements, in negotiations, that it's a silence. And there was nothing but silence here through that. And so we went reporting. I have like a little crew here, my local producer, who is such a courageous person, and he would drive through anything. And while we were driving through all this wires hanging down, blowing in the wind, there were cars burning, and there were dead bodies and the pools of blood. And you see the ambulances, and they can't come to pick up the bodies because the Russians are doing double tap. And if you've been following the war, you might know that this is a technique or tactic that the Russians have been using in Chechnya and in Syria, and of course in all the other parts of Ukraine. And that is when the first responders are coming, the Russians are targeting them. Usually it's artillery, it could be missile, but here they use drones because they are so close that the drones can come. And so I saw an ambulance hiding there, waiting out. And then eventually this ambulance had to pick up a wounded man. And as they did that, the drone hit them, and the man was re-wounded, and the driver and the medical staff were injured again. So they hit an animal shelter. It was just something that is very hard to put into words. I have a video that we can watch some of it. I couldn't be everywhere, but you could see some.
Of course, we'll show some of that to the audience. We can't show some of it because of YouTube's restrictions, but we can point to where they may be able to see that on Telegram and at other places. It seems to me, especially, this isn't just a geopolitical move. This isn't just a calculated move to intensify violence. It is a war strategy. From your perspective, I mean, you dig into not just hybrid warfare, but the psychology and mindset of the Russian elite. There seems also to be an element of absolute, vindictiveness, psychosis. That we're going to inflict violence, not just because we can and it's expedient, but there's an element of, I would say, psychopathic enjoyment, actually, in the carnage that's caused. Is that accurate?
Absolutely, Jonathan. And it's a part of the Russian invasion. There are so many sides to it that are hard to put in words, as I previously mentioned, because of the mentality gap. And we will get to that that's where I want us to arrive, because I have a special message from Ukrainian special services officers that they wanted me to get into the world. And that will include this mentality gap and that, well, if you will, sadistic disposition of the Russian military. And that is, of course, there because, as we mentioned, human safari, if you're not familiar with it yet, one of the appalling parts, everything is appalling about it, right? Because they are hunting women and women pushing strollers and elderly and dogs and occasionally a goat, like anything really. And they can see them. The pilots on the other side of the river can see very well through their goggles whom they are targeting. But not only they do this, which is considered war crime by the international law because it's a purposeful targeting of civilians, but they gleefully and gladly share the videos of the attacks that are taken by the cameras on the drones. These drones have cameras. They're Mavic FPV drones, and they are not very good quality footage, but you could see everything what is happening. So they would attach jolly tunes and with some, well, sadistic, again, jokes, publish threats on their channels, Telegram channels, threatening the people of Kherson. So it's definitely there, but it's not just senseless sadism. And I came across it when I was reporting on the use of torture in Ukraine, in the occupied territories. I went around in 2022 throughout the liberated areas, interviewing the victims and survivors of Russian torture. What I found out that there was a pattern throughout this vast territory, right, from anywhere from Kharkov region to Kherson, and they all followed the same procedure almost, which is a sign of the unwritten order coming from the very top. And that was my suspicion. I wrote about it, and then I was at the press conference at the office of the president in Kiev, and it was dedicated to the tribunal for the Russian crimes, and the panel there of experts confirmed that this, while we don't have the evidence, we don't have the written orders, we have this side evidence, the patterns, the coincidence. And so why do they do it? They're weaponizing fear. That's terrorism. One of the Russian military goals is to push the civilians away from the frontline zones, and that is in the Kherson region, where currently we have about 146,000 in the Kherson region, and 65,000 confirmed as of today living in the city of Kherson. There's still quite a lot of people, and they want them out. And the way they're doing it, they depriving them of human living conditions. The coastal areas have no electricity, no water, no gas for years by now, no internet connection, no communication. And on top of that, they are constantly terrorized, where in such areas as Antonievka, Schidne, coastal areas right by the Dnipro River, people can now only live in the basements. And the same is happening in the Sumy region, or in Chernihiv, or in Kharkov, anywhere close to the border where the small drones can reach. And they are basically terrorizing people with the goal of pushing them out. So again, it's not just a senseless sadism, which is also a part of it, but there's also this government state official policy of using fear as a tool, and it's a part of hybrid warfare. I'm at the site of the last night's strike. These were aerial guided bombs. This is where the children's library used to be. The parts right here on the ground. I've been filming in this building about several months ago when another aerial bomb hit it on Putin's birthday. That was in October. This is what's left now. I have to be careful and watch my step because the drones are dropping the anti-infantry mines. This is what's left of this building. The drugstore is still here.
Вчора мені подзвонили додому в 11 ночі. Двері вибило, вікон немає. Ми так ждали, що ось тільки вони домовляться, якийсь буде мир, і все, ми можемо вздохнути нормально. Але вздихання нет. Мені кажется, що стало ще хуже.
We are driving through what looks like a war movie, only it's not a movie. This is Kherson. You could see the car. That's from a drone attack.
Yeah,
Slowly. Driving where another aerial bomb has hit. So jumping in and out here. The site's so familiar by now. This is Putin's ceasefire. This is the result of the aerial bomb. I heard it, I felt it when it struck.
Авиабомбы. 4 прилета было. По лестничной площадке сбежать в подвал. Такие хлопки сильные. Я то волной повыбивала двери, все. Окна, все разбито. На балконах. Мы в подвале сидели. Люсенька, Люсенька, моя хорошая, моя девочка. Просто геноцид, понимаете? Нас просто уничтожают здесь. Вот как нацию, как народ.
People are still here and fixing the windows. So now we're taught to go inside because drones are here. That's a part of the roof.
We'll come on to hybrid warfare next, but just to take that out, I mean, I think this is something that's not understood. And the minerals deal potentially is a bit of a distraction because it makes people think that this is actually a war about resources, that there's some economic rationality underpinning it. Then, of course, there's the repetition by Kellogg of all sorts of ridiculous relativistic points of view, the both-sidism, and even worse, you've got Witkoff, actually referencing the referendums in those occupied territories as if they had some kind of legitimacy, including the one in Crimea. So you have this extraordinary normalization of these, propaganda narratives. What you're describing, though, as a technique is a form of ethnic cleansing. They are trying to scorched earth in terms of destroying infrastructure, and they are trying to commit a kind of genocide or a kind of ethnic cleansing to get Ukrainians out of there. One would presume in order to either turn these territories into just a blasted zone that no one can live in, or as a precursor to potentially, Russian colonists moving in. Again, this sounds very, very dark, but is this what is actually happening?
Absolutely. The terror that we're seeing here is just not accidental. It's a part of Putin's larger strategy, and not just of territorial control. It's really not about territorial control. All you have to do is just look at the map of the world and look at the size of the Russian Federation. It's not about the territory. It's about imperial ambitions, and we'll get to them again, about the whole Russian world concept, which is at the core of this war, because the Russian Federation, or Russian Empire, is the realm which is driven by ideas. They live in a slightly different realm than the Western world. It's not as rational. It's irrational, and this fanatic ambitions and delusions are what at the core, and therefore erasing Ukrainian sovereignty, erasing the Ukrainian national identity is what really at the heart of the war, and not the conflict. We shouldn't be calling it the conflict. That's again the Kremlin lingo, because conflict means there are two sides arguing. There's no two sides arguing. There's this one aggressor which wants to erase and destroy the other side. And Putin just recently, within the last 2 days, said that we will finally erase them. He used these very words. So yes, that's the part of it. And you mentioned referendums. Referendums didn't just happen in Luhansk or Donetsk or Crimea. It had happened here in the occupied Kherson, because just to refresh some people's memory, you might not remember every detail. Kherson was occupied for 9 months. It was the first regional center to get occupied when the invasion started in February 2022. And by the first third of March, the city was captured by the Russians. And then by September 2022, they held a referendum. And I have interviewed many dozens of people. And I have seen footage, and it will be a part of the documentary that I'm finalizing right now, of a woman walking around with an urn for votes, and there are two armed men with Kalashnikov, the military, walking on the side, and people sitting behind the closed doors and hiding. That's how the referendum went. And the numbers that they are providing is just something, as one of a person I interviewed said, were drawn. They drew these numbers just as they wished. And we see all characteristics of genocide and erasure of national identity, that is kidnapping of the kids, kidnapping of the children from Kherson, that happened en masse. I again interviewed many parents who had to retrieve their children from the other side, and I spoke to a lot of parents who could not retrieve their children, and their children are still in the Russian Federation, stolen by the Russians. They also are mobilizing men in the occupied territories. The Russians impose the Russian passports on Ukrainians in the occupied areas, and the list goes on and on and on. They destroy the TV and radio towers in the areas close to the front line, both in Kherson region and in Sumy region, anywhere they can. So they basically want to have no Ukrainian presence whatsoever anywhere where the Russian world exists.
Let's turn now to this segment, the final segment, which is going to be on hybrid warfare. And then you mention, intriguingly, this message that the the specialist teams you met in Ukraine, there's a particular message they want to convey and get across to a wider audience. So let's talk about this, because we talk about hybrid warfare as if it's something separate from the kinetic warfare, but actually we see that these spurious peace negotiations, the way the US team is being manipulated, and the violence, this is all part of the same. These are just facets of the same war. They're not separate in any way.
Oh, absolutely. And before we go into that, and that's very important, I just want to mention that also we see the uptick, as you say, of the Russian attempts to cross the river. And every day, and especially every night, I hear the fire, and not just artillery fire, but Kalashnikovs and machine guns and mortar and tanks. And we have the reports, and I had a lot of interviews with the military who see dozens of the Russian soldiers attempting to cross the river, and it is called the one-way ticket. It's basically a suicidal mission, because it's very hard because of the landscape to cross. They're very visible, and they are being destroyed by dozens daily again. And there are reports of the soldiers being drugged. And I'm doing right now a very interesting story on the use of drugs to enhance this almost zombie behavior, when I had the description of Russian soldiers walking over the dead bodies of their, as they call, comrades, to proceed. And it's also a part of a hybrid warfare where, physical is mixed with the mental and psychological. And unfortunately, we will not have time to go into it now, because I really want to deliver this message. I'm working on an exclusive article, which will be a detail at length article for Byline Times. And I interviewed several special services, special forces officers. Of course, they cannot give their names. That was in a secret location, in a very film-like setting, with the fire outside again and all that. And they were very serious, and took several hours to deliver this message. They said that especially Europeans and the British, because the Americans are kind of, which is hard for me to say, I'm an American, I'm from California, but they say don't bother with Americans. They are doing their own thing. We don't know what they are doing, and neither do I. But the Europeans still here, they still kind of act insane, and they can still be warned. So please warn them that, first of all, Russians are working very hard at infiltrating the societies of the European Unions and the United Kingdom. And the way they do it, they gave me several techniques and methods of how they done. They use the Russian diaspora, Russian-speaking immigrant communities, and they warned that, of course, we shouldn't be looking at every Russian immigrant as an agent of an FSB. You know, paranoia is not a place here. But there is a certain technique which has been used here in Ukraine before the kinetic phase started. And it started already in 2001, when the first wave of what we know as sleeper agents started arriving here. And they use different covers. They use stories, anything from the security firms to the businessmen or opposition leaders is a very popular legend. They call it a legend as a cover. When when there would be someone who has a loud scandal somewhere in Moscow where they go on some protest or there's some provocation, and then they're put in jail briefly, and then somehow they escape and they find themselves somewhere in London, let's say, and then they take a long time to get accustomed to the Russian speakers there, and then they start recruiting, sort of like in a Lenin cell. That is a very old technique, and they use both what they call acting in the dark or in the light, when some people are recruited and they are acting knowingly, they're being either paid or they have some other interest, there's some PR or something there at stake for them to go for that, to work for the FSB or for the Russian secret services. Or a lot of times these Russian diaspora members, figures, don't know that they are being used and abused and manipulated. They believe that what they do is needed for the opposition movement and to confront Putin's regime. And they give me examples, and I'm going to be working on that. So certain caution and precaution needs to be exercised. The same goes for businessmen and criminals. Criminals are used, and it's a very old tradition. The NKVD and the KGB used to do that. I wrote some research a while ago about the Russian criminals living in Trump's Tower in New York and Florida and Taj Mahal and so forth. So that happens, and that's what they had to deal in Kherson. And then when the Russians came, suddenly all the sleepers activated, and then they started to work for the Russians openly. And a lot of them were double agents. They also work for security services. So it's a real threat, and they're very active at that. And they call it legending. They're making up a legend and stuff. We mentioned the crime and business, and they also use their communions of compatriots. So whenever you see some movements or something like Immortal Regiment March, or events or celebrations of some old Soviet holidays, this is how the Russian world is expanding. And recently we had someone named Vladislav Surkov, who claims that he is the architect of the Russian world. Actually, several people claim that, so we don't know exactly who is behind it, but he's certainly one of the authors of the concept. And he gave an interview, first time since the beginning of the full-scale invasion, to Le Express, and he said that, I'm not quoting verbatim, but basically it was that Russian world is always expanding. The Russians are where the Russian is spoken, that's where the Russian world is. And we, quote unquote, the Russians are only alive when they expanded and taken over the world. So it was very direct. And it's a very scary interview. I actually recommend reading it because they are not even hiding it. And the same if you look at the recent interviews by Alexander Dugin, who for whatever reason was interviewed by CNN. We need to find out what was that. That's a part of hybrid warfare as well. And the officers who spoke to me here mentioned that tactic as well, when the experts or influences are being hired or yes, Johnson?
And we know that from Russians at War as well. This propaganda movie that continues to be shown to film festival audiences, shown in universities. It's an extraordinary normalization of these sometimes quite crude, sometimes quite sophisticated propaganda products.
Exactly. That's a great example. And not only that, they use the new movies and they use the old movies. They are showing the old Soviet movies and weaponize nostalgia. And so that way they're able to trigger the feelings of longing for the gun use for people who grew up not just in Russia but in the post-Soviet space, because mind you, everybody was forced to speak Russian and everybody lost their languages. Like I know my ancestors only spoke Yiddish and Ukrainian. I have the letters. They didn't know how to speak Russian, but they were forced to learn Russian and forget their own languages. And so the same happened to Kazakhs, to I don't know, Belarusian people, people in Moldova, and so forth, all the republics and the sphere of the former Soviet Union. So that's what we call the post-Soviet space. And not so that's the soft propaganda, the culture and the movies. They also use a very powerful tool, the officers told me, not to be ignored, the church and religious community. And that's not just the Russian Orthodox Church, but other churches as well. And they're used to spread the false narratives and brainwash people, especially people who are experiencing hard living conditions, the new immigrants with faith is being used basically as a crutch. And at that point, people are particularly vulnerable, and the church and the priests who are notoriously known as working for the FSB and previously for the KGB, are using their influence to recruit these people now. We're not talking about some active measures in the 80s, folks. This is what I want to bring your attention to. This is not some serial lecture about how the KGB used to act during the Cold War. No, this is happening right now as we speak. And another tool, as we all know, if you live in Europe, you of course know, very aware of the terrorist attacks. And they're very often also used by the Russians. And here we go back to weaponizing fear, like in Kherson or in Sumy, where the drones are being used for that. The terrorist attacks used for that, and they're kind of very multi-purpose. Because they also distract. And so anytime when the terrorist act is happening, you can be sure that something very significant is going on geopolitically. So it's a good time to check on the news. We mentioned the artists, and overall the goal here is demoralization and sowing of discord and confusion in the Western society. And that is hardly new. I've been talking about it for 10 years. And I think this is why this officers reached up to me, because they know that I understand that. And there are many, many more tactics that I will be writing about. We just don't have time to go in detail about all of this. But basically, the lessons are to stay alert, to be aware, to check the narratives. And of course, we don't have time. We didn't go into the whole virtual arena. We were only talking about the real life, but there's the whole other slice of it on the internet, on social media, on the platforms where so much is going on now as we speak. And Jonathan, you would know because I believe your account was just hacked, wasn't it?
It was. There was some weird pro-Russian stuff put up there, and a number of sort of, filthy replies sent to a few people. I haven't still figured out whether it was a data leak or not, but anyway, passwords are changed, encryption has been added. But as someone said, if they start to bother to hack you, and it's not part of some, broad data breach, but it seems more targeted, then it kind of means that what you're doing must be having an effect. If it's irritating them to the point where they bother to expend resources on you.
I think we've all been targeted at some point or another while fighting back. And at some point, they, again, weaponize fear and give you a signal that, it could get worse. And of course, hacking the Twitter account doesn't sound as scary, but we need to keep in mind, and that was the main message of the officers who contacted me, that we are dealing with the culture and with the country with an entirely different mentality. And that's what is really not being seen. I still see how the Western society and Western people are projecting their values, their psychology, their perception of life on the Russians. And what doesn't help is that Russians physically look and present just as the Western society citizens. It's hard to tell the difference. Even in the Soviet Union, the difference was more visible in the way people dressed and even in the facial expressions. And these days, the people who are traveling to the West could be indistinguishable from the Westerners. But don't let them mock you. Don't let them deceive you, because the difference in the mentality is vast. We're dealing with a lawless society, with a mafia state, where people have to grow up as opportunists, where the only language that is understood is the language of force, where negotiations are useless and futile. And they quoted Bismarck, the agreement is not worth the paper it's signed on. And this is happening right now on the global arena, where we are trying, or the United States is trying to negotiate and sign a ceasefire with Russia. And Ukrainians know that this is useless, because each time there was a ceasefire throughout the last 11 years, Russians broke it, just as they broke it in Kherson on the 27th of March, on Armageddon Day that I mentioned to you, when the power lines went down, just as the ceasefire was called. That will continue to be so. We're dealing with different mentality, different culture, and that's the main message here that I was asked to pass on to everyone.
Well, Zarina, we really do appreciate that. My trick in the 1990s to try and distinguish Russians from foreigners was to look at the eyes. Yes, the clothes were a dead giveaway, often how people walk and hold themselves, but the eyes, because Westerners have soft, moist, vulnerable eyes, weak eyes, as some Russians would privately call it, and there's a cold hardness behind many of the eyes. Well, that was the 90s. I don't know if that still works as a distinguishing feature, but that certainly held then. Your work is massively appreciated. I'm so glad you're able to come on to deliver that message from the sort of intelligence officers and the soldiers that you're in contact with. It's massively important. and important that their voices are heard through you this time. But, I'm trying more and more on the channel to get these Ukrainian voices on, especially if they speak a bit of English. I think it's tremendously important. It's fantastic speaking to you. And of course, where you are, what you're doing, the risks you're taking are extraordinary, and your reporting is too. So thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much, Jonathan. Thank you, everyone. And let's hope for the best. Все буде Україна, as they say here.
Героям слава, смерть ворогам.